students, here we are again. I want to really unpack these next couple of slides that are arguably the most important slides of really all of period 3. In order to know where we were, we have to understand what we or where we are now, we have to understand what we were. And a lot of it is based on kind of what you can think of as the first draft of the Constitution. It was known as the Articles of Confederation. Now, keep in mind, this was not after the war. This was the Articles of Confederation were drafted long before the Treaty of Paris of 1783 ever happened because we needed to have a legitimate government in order to sign that treaty. And so that's what the Articles of Confederation did. It unified these newly independent states. The Articles of Confederation was in 1777. So we've already had the Declaration of Independence. We are in the middle of the war. It's not going real well for the Americans, but some of the things the tide is turning on certain things. Eventually we'll get France's help and we'll come to the end of the war. In the meantime, we have to figure out how to run a country. And so they wanted to create a government with only limited central power. When I talk about central power, I'm talking about the federal government. So they wanted to have strong state governments and very weak central governments, which makes total sense knowing where we came from, right? Like, we don't want another king on our hands. We don't want another monarchy. We need to have representation from the people. So after the revolution, this is when we see a lot of the Articles of Confederation just couldn't hold up. It just was not a strong enough document. And so we have to revise. But before we get there, let's kind of talk about what the Articles of Confederation did do and what they didn't do. Because there were some things like difficult with trade and finance and commerce, foreign relations, and there really was a need for a stronger central government. First and foremost, you need to highlight this. The Articles of Confederation had a unicameral legislature, which means there was no president and there was no court system. They had a legislative body and that was it, and they didn't have the power to tax. Now let me say that again. They didn't have the power to tax. We are 1777 in the middle of the war. Wars are expensive. How are we going to pay for this war? That means the states have to pay for this war. Well, let me put it to you this way. If you're Delaware and you're a very small state, or you're Virginia and you're a very large state, who pays? Who pays more? Is it a flat rate? Is it a proportion? Does it matter how many wars were fought? How much destruction happens in your state? This is a very difficult situation to wage war and not have payments coming regularly from a government. They didn't have the power to draft soldiers or regulate trade. Each state could draft soldiers, the state militias, but there was no the Continental Army was funded through the state. There was no judicial or executive branch. There were lots of tariff and currency disputes, meaning if I'm going to continue to trade with France, if I'm, say, whatever country, whatever state I am, let's just say I'm North Carolina and I want to continue to trade with France. Then does France have different rules if France trades with North Carolina, if France trades with Virginia? And then you get into all these disputes. Can you cross lines into Virginia? It became a real problem. There were some Spanish restrictions on the Mississippi River. Now, this is going to come a little later. Remember when I told you what the Treaty of Paris finally did when the war ended? The United States was granted the area up from the coastline up to the Mississippi River. But the Spanish did not actually recognize this Treaty of Paris where the United States had control on the Mississippi. The Spanish had that control. And now they're kind of going like, wait, this is no. So now we have another problem on our hands, which becomes more of a diplomatic problem as well. There was British occupation in the forts on U.S. land. Part of it was the British were supposed to evacuate those forts and leave those forts, and they didn't actually completely do that, and that's going to cause a problem. But this is the next one. Number 7 is the one that you need to know. You know, like Bacon's Rebellion, the tastiest of our rebellions? I don't know how you're going to get to know Shays' Rebellion because it's not very tasty, but it is entirely important. So here's the deal. Shays' Rebellion, we're talking 1786, 1787. The war is over, right? The war is over. America is unified. We have the Articles of Confederation. Life is beautiful. We're making this work, right? Except there's no power to tax. Here's the problem. Daniel Shays was a military veteran. He was a farmer. He was out from the western parts of New York, and the western parts of Massachusetts. And he had been a veteran of the war. He had been promised that he would be paid for both, like, not being able to take care of his farm and as a veteran to get a pension. Well, they weren't paying the veterans. In fact, they were supposed to even be back paid for pay that they never got while they were in service in the military during the war, and they never got paid. Daniel Shays leads a rebellion, and in fact, it's kind of the wake-up call to pretty much all of the states saying, "Whoa, what are we going to do?" Like Daniel Shays and his friends, they storm into a munitions factory. They're going to like basically take it over. They're demanding payments because they didn't get what was promised to them, because nobody can pay them, right? Massachusetts is like, well, we're not paying you because you actually didn't, do all of your fighting in our state, and New York is like, well, we're not paying you because so it was a mess. Shays' Rebellion made us realize we didn't have a strong enough central government, and this could continue to happen if we don't figure this out. Another problem was the Newburgh Conspiracy, and this had to do with my guy, with George Washington. The Newburgh Conspiracy was this kind of plan, if you will, that it didn't happen because George Washington found out about it, but they were going to kind of like overthrow the soldiers were upset. They were it was a conspiracy in the military, and the soldiers were upset with the way things were happening. Word was getting around that they weren't going to be paid for like some time, and they demanded payment from Congress, or they were going to like rebel and what's the word when you leave and you take off, like go AWOL, and they were going to like take out leading officers. And George Washington is absolutely, if you read what he says in response to the Newburgh Conspiracy, actually it's kind of like I'm your dad. I've been with you this whole time, and you're doing this to me now. It's really powerful words, and the response from the soldiers was kind of like shame and like disheartened, like, oh, I can't believe we thought we were gonna get away with this and do this. Like, I can't. Okay, no, we're sorry, we did. But the Newburgh conspiracy showed us that there's some cracks in the system, and people are going to demand what they are promised, because now we have a United States of America. And so the Annapolis Convention, people realized because of Shays' because of Shays' Rebellion, we got to do something about this. The Annapolis Convention this is our Alexander Hamilton. This is Madison and Hamilton saying, we better meet because this weak central government is not working for us. Okay, so I'm setting the stage here, right? The next slide then is when they meet and we have our first constitutional convention. What are we going to do? Like, how are we going to make the Articles of Confederation stronger? Because clearly for the past 6-8 years, it ain't been working. It's not been strong enough. And it's Shays' Rebellion that really tips the scale to help us realize this. So delegates from each of the states participate in a constitutional convention. I should tell you that 12 of the 13 states showed up to it. Rhode Island didn't show up. And through negotiation, collaboration, compromise, they propose a constitution that creates a limited but dynamic central government. limited but dynamic, meaning it's stronger than the articles ever gave it, the central government ever gave it, but it's still going to be limited, embodying federalism and providing for a separation of powers between three branches. So what we come up with, and this is a guy named Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman kind of basically comes up with this, what we call the Great Compromise. It was a compromise between two differing types of states. We have the New Jersey plan, which was a relatively small state, and the Virginia plan. So Roger Sherman comes up with what we know as the Great Connecticut. He's from Connecticut, the Great Compromise. And basically, it allowed for three branches of government, but more importantly, it allowed for larger states to have representation equally, or for all states to have representation equally. But then another separate part of the legislature would have representatives based on population. So we understand, like, the upper house, what we call the upper house of Congress, we call the Senate. Everybody gets 2 votes, right? Everybody gets 2 people to represent in the Senate. That's every single state. However, the smaller states like New Jersey, they don't provide that much money. They don't provide that many resources. They don't provide that many troops. And so therefore, then the big state said, we should have more of a say because we got more people. We're generating more for the economy. We're doing more. We're adding more. So then larger states with higher populations would have their populations or their representation based on population. And we know this is the lower part of the Congress, the lower house of Congress, or the lower chamber of Congress called the House of Representatives. So it became this fantastic compromise that they realized this is the best way to do it. They created this system of checks and balances where each of the 3 branches, the judicial, executive, and legislative branch, I'll get my words out, could all have a check or balance on the other. So we're living this right now. We are seeing right now the power that the executive branch has. The executive branch has the power to name Supreme Court justices. And once they're named for life. Well, there's a lot of people saying that's going to tip the scales, if you will, if Trump is able to nominate another Supreme Court justice before the election happens. So again, this is all about, the representation. We have an electoral college, and if there's a lot of not conspiracy, but what's the word I'm looking for? Where people don't like the electoral college. I can't think the word. Anyway, people don't like the electoral college. If you would really look at a map, the population, the elections could be decided by about 4 or 5 states. Most of them are on the coastlines. North Dakota would really be worthless. 2016 was a perfect example. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. Donald Trump won the electoral vote because he had more votes in certain states that could swing the vote for them. The Supreme Court was put in to establish. John Jay becomes the first Supreme Court justice. And here we go again, the idea of republicanism. This idea that the people are giving the consent to the government. It doesn't matter if you're the federal government or you're the state government, you're the local government. The people are giving the power for others to legislate and others to run the government. But it's coming through an election. Like, somebody has to represent me. You don't just get it. It's not because you're rich. It's not because it's been passed down to you or something like this. And then finally, the idea of federalism. And federalism is this shared power. It's where power is divided between the state and federal governments. And this is really important because in some instances we see a strong central government, and in some instances we see a strong state government. Right now we're talking about that. Our what we're dealing with coronavirus in North Dakota is very different than what they're dealing with coronavirus in, say, New York. Well, the beauty of federalism is that President Trump has kind of said, governors, you got to do you. You got to take care of your own state, because I can't make one size fits all, blanket statement to happen throughout all of the United States. Okay, that was a lot to kind of unpack there. I hope if you have some questions, you're thinking about them, you're writing them down, make sure you understand that the Great Compromise was to kind of connect. If you look at that little graphic right there, the Senate would have 2 senators per state. In a state like New Jersey, great. The House would have, would be based on population and the ratio. More people equals more votes. Now we're going to get to the next slide. If more people means more votes and large states want to be heard, that also means that you can have the power to tax those people, correct? So here's what also came out of the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention compromised over the representation of slave states in Congress and the role of the federal government in regulating both slavery and the slave trade, allowing the prohibition of the international slave trade after 1808. You should maybe underline that last bit of the sentence. The slave trade would be prohibited after 1808. So let's first talk about the 3/5 Compromise. The 3/5 Compromise basically said for every 5 slaves, I can't even hardly even say this. For every 5 enslaved people, they would be counted as 3 people. I don't even like to say that out loud. It's just so, I can't even think about that. They were not even fully human beings. Every 5 slaves meant that 3 people could be a count of their population. Now, in let's say a slave-heavy state like Virginia, that's really important, right? They want to have their slaves counted, because that means it ups their votes in the House of Representatives. But then it also means that they are going to be taxed more. And so this idea of the 3/5 Compromise, it was not going to, you couldn't maintain it. It was vital. The 3/5 Compromise was absolutely vital to getting the Constitution passed. If the 3/5 Compromise hadn't been passed, I don't think Virginia and maybe even Maryland, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, I don't think any of the slave states that we considered would have stayed with the Union. I think they would have just done their own thing. Well, we're going to see by time 1860 rolls around really what's going to happen. It's hard to even think about. Part of the Constitutional Convention with the 3/5 Compromise was the Slave Trade Compromise. The Slave Trade Compromise said that the federal government will allow the slave trade to continue. We will allow human beings to be traded as a commodity until 1808. It basically allowed slavery to guarantee to be allowed for another 20 years. Essentially, that's what was being said. That's really important. We know slavery is going to be outlawed, but for the next 20 years, you can have it. Well, can you kind of imagine how this is going to affect people who are slave owners? People who own human beings, how much that is really, they're going to want to ramp up. They're going to want to have as many slaves as they can in the next 20 years, because eventually that's going to, that gravy train is going to come to an end, and they know it. That's a really kind of sad way to think about it. And finally, the Fugitive Slave Clause. The Fugitive Slave Clause said a couple of things. One, it said that runaway slaves who ran away to the north where slavery was illegal in some of those northern states now. They had to be returned back to their plantation owners in the south. So, like, if you were caught harboring a slave in the north, you could be like punished for it, you could be fined for it, and slaves had to be returned to their owners and brought back to the south. This is going to be a real tough, and so this is, we're not even getting into the moral stance of slavery. This has become completely an economic and political thing. There are people who are like, I don't want to send back this guy who I just saw sleeping in my shed. I can tell that he needs some help, but then you are legally obliged to return those slaves back to their owners. That was another clause that was put in there. So, this was a lot to think about. We're going to listen to Hamilton here in the next couple days when we come to class. If you've ever seen the musical, and Hamilton, this was a huge issue for Hamilton, for all of the founding fathers. How do we handle the slave trade? So I really hope that we can have good discussions about this in class. If there's any questions, please jot them down, and we'll meet up again and talk this out some more. All right, until next time, we'll see you then.